Longfellow's poem "Paul Revere's Ride" was first published in 1863. The poem recounts the events of April 18, 1775, when Revere made his famous midnight ride to warn the rebel American colonists that the British army was advancing. The poem is organized into rhymed stanzas of differing lengths. The poem is written in tetrameters. Most of the lines in this poem are structured using anapes. An anapest is a poetic food consisting of three syllables, the first two unstressed and the third stressed. However, Longfellow frequently varies the meter in the poem. Let's see the summary of the poem. The opening stanza forms a narrative frame for the poem as a whole. The opening stanza, which takes place in the present, and the closing stanza, which directs our attention to the future, frame or surround the body of the poem, which takes place in the past. In these opening lines, the narrator, the landlord of the Wayside Inn, invites his guests to hear the story of Paul Revere. These lines are also addressed to the reader. We, along with the guests at the inn, are being invited into the world of colonial America. The landlord's use of the phrase, "my children," suggests that he is much older than his audience. Negative tone, his command that we listen, suggests that the landlord is accustomed to giving orders. He is an authority figure, and as such, we can believe the story he is about to tell. The poem was published in 1863. 88 years after the events recounted in the poem, very few people who could remember that time would still be alive. We are encouraged to wonder if perhaps the venerable narrator himself might be able to recall the events of 1775. By emphasizing the historicity of these events, Longfellow suggests from the outset that we are dealing with the stuff of leg end. Lines 6 to 10 begins with the heart of the narrative. He, that is Paul Revere, his friend is Robert Newnham, the young man who would hang the signal North Church Tower. Longfellow immediately draws us into the story by beginning in medias res, in the middle of the action. Longfellow assumes we know the background information. Earlier that April, the British forces had received secret orders to advance from God, a town about 20 miles northwest of Boston, in order to seize the weapon and ammunition that the rebels had stockpiled there. The British were also supposed to capture the rebel leaders, John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who were in Lexington, a town on the road to Concord. Though word had leaked out that the British would mobilize on the night of April 18, it was unclear whether they would move by land or sea. That night, then, the colonists arranged for a signal light to be shown from the old North Church Tower, indicating how the British. The opposite shore is Charleston, which was across the Charles River from Boston. The poem suggests that Revere would already be outside of Boston, awaiting the signal. In fact, it was Revere himself who brought word to Newnham that the British were moving by water. Speaking to Newnham, Revere left Boston and began his ride. Newnham's signal light was actually intended for Dawes, the other messenger, who spread the alarm that night. Longfellow has effectively combined the roles of Revere and Dawes by making Revere the only messenger. Longfellow emphasizes his heroic stature. Revere rose across the Charles River to Charleston, where he was provided with a horse. Here again, Longfellow highlights Revere's heroism by depicting him acting. Lines 17 to 19 depict the British ship, the Somerset, which lay at the mouth of the Charles. The ship, which is portrayed as massive and foreboding, symbolizes the immense power of the British forces. Longfellow takes an entire line to introduce her name, Just as she is dauntingly alone in the bay, she stands alone in line 19. The images in lines 20 to 23 that Longfellow employs describes the ship. By calling the Somerset a phantom ship, Longfellow emphasizes its ghostly, death-like, and potentially death-bringing presence. The silhouette of its mast against the moon is reminiscent of prison bars, another reminder of the dangers awaiting Revere. Note that the term phantom actually describes a dream image. Longfellow is perhaps hinting here that although British forces might have seen the end, their power was illusory or dreamlike, especially in comparison to the eventual strength of the American rebels. In lines 24 to 30, Longfellow turns our attention back to Newnham, who is apparently spying on the British to determine whether they will advance by land or sea. Longfellow's technique here is almost cinematic as he cuts abruptly from one scene to another. The oral quality of this stanza stands out. We, along with Newnham, must train our ears to hear in the dark. Against this backdrop of silence, after seeing the British soldiers moving toward the Charles, Newnham returns to the church to place a signal in the tower. Longfellow maintains the tone of urgent silence in these lines as he depicts Newnham climbing up the stairs with stealthy tread, with as quiet a footstep as he can manage. The atmosphere becomes eerie as Newnham accidentally awakens the pigeons as they move about on the rafters in the dark. They are almost unrecognizable. The term shade sometimes refers to ghosts or spirits, and there is a sense here that Newnham is perhaps moving into forbidden, deathly territory. Having reached the top of the stairs, Newnham ascends even higher using a ladder so that he can get to the topmost window. From this window, he can look down over the city of Boston. As Newnham passes, the poem itself also seems to pause. The pace slows and the atmosphere becomes less charged. Though up to this point we, along with Newnham, have been in the dark, suddenly the moonlight illumines the scene. Recall that in the line 21, the moon served as the ghastly backdrop for the prison bar silhouette of the mast of the Somerset. Here, however, the moon appears benevolent as it gently bathes the city of Boston in light. It is almost as though the forces of nature itself are tenderly encouraging and sustaining the colonists. In lines 42 to 43, Longfellow brings us even further into the past as he reminds us of the earliest settlers. The moonlight illuminates the graveyard adjacent to the church, and Newnham can see the headstones beneath which are buried the colonists' ancestors. The term night encampment, however, seems odd in this context. Ordinarily, it would apply to a temporary campsite, usually for an army. Longfellow is suggesting then that the souls of the dead themselves constitute an army of sorts, a force that will support and sustain the rebels in the impending war. In lines 48, Longfellow develops the military imagery. He personifies the wind, comparing it to a sentinel or god. In this smile, the headstones themselves are figured forth as the tents which the wind is guarding. At first, the wind's words of comfort, all is well, appear to be to the headstones. They might equally be directed, however, to the living army of rebel soldiers who are about to fight. Longfellow is again suggesting then that nature itself is protecting and encouraging the American soldiers. We are abruptly brought back from the distant past as Longfellow reminds us that Newnham's thoughts about the graveyard have lasted only a moment. He also reminds us that if nature is protecting the American soldiers, the threat of death, that secret dread, still remains. In lines 52 to 56, Longfellow abandons the slow pace he had employed in describing the graveyard. As Newnham sees the British soldiers boarding the Somerset, the tone of the poem once again becomes urgent. Even as the tide rises, the tension mounts in the verse itself. Note the use of alliteration in these lines. The staccato or short bar adds to the sense of tension. The line of black boards moving across the charts is suggestive of a snake, hinting at the sinister nature of the British forces. As you read lines 57 to 72, notice how throughout Longfellow directs our gaze. He begins the stanza with another bold cinematic gesture, cutting back from Newnham in the tower to the main action. Paul Revere, waiting for the signal to ride, for the first time in the poem, we can look directly at Paul Revere. Though Longfellow offers us little physical description of the hero, he does tell us that Revere is impatient, eager to risk his life for the cause of colonial rights. His heavy stride also appears strong and confident. Next, Longfellow invites us to look at the broader scene as Revere waits impatiently for the signal. Note how Longfellow's diction heightens the sense of impatience. Each of these lines begins with either an adverb or a conjunction. Now, then, and, but. These terse words force us to shift our attention with each new line. As we watch Revere pat his horse, look at the landscape, stamp the earth, and then fiddle with his horse's saddle, we are as distracted as he is. In lines 64 to 67, Longfellow directs our attention back to the Old North Church. In spite of his distraction, Revere continues to look for the signal from Newnham. Revere views the same graveyard that Newnham had gazed upon. In fact, he is looking at the graveyard at precisely the same time as Newnham. The major difference here is that Longfellow has reversed the perspective. Newnham looks down from the tower at the graveyard. Revere, however, looks up at the graveyard and the tower from a distance. Finally, Longfellow directs our attention to the tower window itself. We see that Newnham shines two lanterns, indicating that the British are indeed moving by sea. By gradually narrowing the perspective throughout the stanza, so that by the end of it we are looking only at the two lights in the window, Longfellow has increased the impact of this climatic moment. At this point, Longfellow begins his portrayal of Revere's actual ride. Longfellow does not refer to Revere himself. Instead, he focuses on the incredible speed of Revere's horse. The rider of this horse, Longfellow then informs us, is the fate of a nation. This phrase means that Revere's ability to warn the rebels that the British were approaching would determine the outcome not only of the conflicts at Lexington and Concord, but of the entire American Revolution. Revere has become totally identified with his mission. He is no longer simply a man, he is America's future. On a literal level, the spark that is struck is a result of the steed's iron horseshoes striking the cobblestones. On a deeper level, however, Longfellow is suggesting that Paul Revere's ride effectively ignites. In lines 81 to 86, we see Revere leaving Charleston and moving into the Massachusetts countryside. We are suddenly made aware of the natural imagery: a river, the ocean, trees, rocks, and sand. Though Revere's mission is urgent, the natural elements around him are completely at peace. In the next three stanzas, Longfellow reminds us repeatedly of the time. The repetition of the same introductory phrase, in this case, "it was by the village clock," is called anaphora. In this stanza, which takes place at midnight, Longfellow depicts Revere's passing through Medford, a town just a few miles outside of Boston. These lines suggest Revere's isolation. He is the only human being awake and about at this hour. 1 hour later, Revere arrives in Lexington, about 12 miles outside of Boston. We have a through the town, moving so quickly that he catches only glimpses of the scenery, such as a single weather vane. In lines 97 to 100, Longfellow personifies the windows of the meeting house. Ordinarily, we would expect to see through windows. These windows, however, themselves possess the ability to see. They seem, moreover, to be able to see into the future, to predict the conflict that will take place in Lexington the following morning, in which the first colonists will be killed. Notice that from this point forward, Longfellow repeatedly turns our attention to future events. The events in the next stanza also diverge markedly from historical fact. Revere was captured by the British shortly after he left Lexington. Another man, however, Samuel Prescott, was able to get to Concord. Here we again see Longfellow magnifying Revere's role. Lines 107 to 110 again turn our attention to the future as they remind us of the fate that awaits the American soldiers. Longfellow heightens the pathos of this idea by focusing on the destiny and death of a single man. Line 111, Longfellow's use of a caesura after rest abruptly brings the tale to a halt and brings us back to the present. The rest of the stanza summarizes the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. Because the American rebels had received advance notice, they were able to resist the British. Longfellow emphasizes the fact that whereas British army was composed of regulars or paid professionals, the American forces consisted of farmers, volunteers who were fighting because of their devotion to the cause. Longfellow uses the final lines of the poem to link the past with the future. He suggests that Revere's message will continue to inspire Americans to defend the cause of liberty. Note the way in which line 128 echoes the first line of the poem. Just as the landlord has asked his guests to listen to his story, Longfellow is urging his readers to listen to the future calls to defend justice and freedom. Time is a recurring theme in Longfellow's works. In this poem, Longfellow does not relate time to grief, but he still uses the concept of time in two separate ways to get his overall point across. First, he tells Revere's story through the voice of an after the event. In telling us that hardly a man is still alive who remembers that famous day and year, the poet accomplishes a dual purpose. First, he identifies it as something that could be remembered, and in doing this, he establishes Revere's ride as an actual event. But by placing it on the border of memory, he also allows himself the opportunity to turn fact into legend. Actually, there would have been no one alive when Longfellow wrote this poem who would have remembered the event. The second way he uses time in this poem is by constantly reminding the reader of its passing as the story progresses in order to increase dramatic tension. Almost anyone who he would expect to read this poem would know in advance what the outcome was, so there was no way to keep readers anxious for the ending. In order for this poem to have its impact, the British soldiers must be seen by the reader as a non-human, irredeemable force of evil, and Paul Revere must be an indisputable force of good. Since the world is not clearly divided along such lines, this requires a little oversimplification on Longfellow's part. First of all, goodness is associated with powerfulness, as if he is able to accomplish extraordinary deeds because the force of goodness is behind him. We see him devise a plan, cross the river, and ride alone from one deserted town to the next. In reality, this was a project that several people participated in, including another rider. But our culture so strongly links virtue with ability that readers are more likely to admire Revere's goodness if we are told that he was able to achieve beyond normal human ability. Similarly, the British are faceless, dehumanized murderers and cowards. They appear in the sixth stanza as a line of black that bends and floats like a column of ants, and later are referred to not as people but as clothes, the red coats. In the same way that Revere's virtue is proven by his success, the enemy's failure is linked to the evilness. In the 12th stanza, for instance, we are given a quick sketch of a man who was asleep in his bed and then, with the innocence of sleep still on him, was shot dead. The poem makes a point of mentioning that it was a British shot that killed him, a fact that was already implied, but is nonetheless pointed out for emotional impact. In the following stanza, the British run away, having neither the moral power to fight well nor the moral conviction to fight to the death. The poem equates goodness with strength, which is one of the main factors